It's like coming into a surprise birthday party or something. This is great. Angela, how's everyone?
Good.
Great, great, great. Today, what I want to do is give you some information about colds and influenza and our current products, Echinacea Plus and Supertonic, that we use as our main prevention and treatment for colds and influenza, and the new cold and flu herbal shot that I've designed with those two products and a few extras for treatment and prevention of colds and flu. And I wanted you to look at these numbers up there for a minute. The top one is 1 billion. That's what 1 billion looks like. And I wanted you to know that this fall, which we're in right now, just started, and winter, but about over the next 5 months, that's how many infections of colds and flus will be in America. There'll be 1 billion cases of colds and flus. Now you might think, well gosh, but America only has a population of 300 million, plus or minus a few million, which is true, which means that the average American is going to get 3.5 cold and flu infections in the wintertime. And because I'm not going to get one, that means someone out there is getting 7, which really means, and you all know these people, they're just sick all fall and all winter. Just when they about get ready to get out of bed, they're back again with something. And you hear people say it, I can't shake this cold, I can't shake this flu. Well, they might be having bacterial and viral infections all winter long that are different, and that's why sometimes it's worse and better, but some people are just sick all winter long. Now the next number is 150 million. And 150 million are the number of infections of influenza that there'll be. The first one, 1 billion, is colds, bacterial infections, upper respiratory infections, and viral infections, influenza. But 150 million is the amount of influenza infections alone, and that's usually more serious than the bacterial infections. The flu is the one that hurts like hell, your body aches, you're in a lot of pain, you have a high fever often, and you feel like you've been run over by a truck. Often the bacterial colds are more like the sniffles and the sore throat and things like that. And the one that nobody likes to get is influenza, because that's the one where you just feel really, really, really horrible and you can't get out of bed. And so there'll be 150 million cases of influenza. Now that's about 50% of America. But often people get the flu more than once in the same year. So not exactly half of America gets it, but that's how many cases, individual cases, there will be of influenza. The next number down is 200,000. 200,000 is the amount of Americans that will end up in the hospital in the next 5 months with colds and influenza, because they will get so sick, they'll go to the emergency room, and the doctors will think they're so ill, they will admit them to the hospital. That's a lot of people. And 40,000, the number with the red circle around it, is the number of people that will die in the next 5 months. 40,000 Americans dead, guaranteed in the next 4 to 5 months from influenza. 40,000 men, women, and children in America will be dead, guaranteed. If it's a light year, if it's a heavy year, that number can go up to 70,000. And if it's a real bad year, it can go into the millions. It can be what's called a worldwide pandemic, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now the smaller number under that, 4,175, that's the amount of people that have been killed in the last 5 years. Not in the next 5 months, but in the last 5 years from the war in Iraq. Okay, now look at that number. And that's the number one issue that you hear in the presidential campaign. Now, as far as I'm personally concerned, and I think all of you know my viewpoints, I think that's 4,175 too many people dead by warfare. I think here we are in the age of Aquarius in the new millennium, and we ought to figure out better ways to deal with each other than blowing each other up. But I just wanted to put it in perspective, because 10 times more people that have died in the last 5 years in Iraq, which again is the issue on the presidential campaign right now, 10 times more are going to be dead in the next 5 months. 10 times more Americans are going to be dead just from influenza. And when's the last time you heard Obama or McCain talking about influenza? It's not a topic, okay? And it is a reoccurring epidemic. It is the only reoccurring epidemic in America that comes back every year. There are other epidemics, but they don't reoccur. Influenza is a guaranteed reoccurring epidemic of epidemic proportions. Anything that kills 40,000 people is considered an epidemic. Okay, that's almost the amount of people that died in the whole Vietnam War. So that's a pretty wild number, guaranteed in the next 5 months. And the little numbers below it, 20,000. That's the number of people that will die of AIDS this year in America. Okay, only. And that's in an entire year. We have 40,000 dead in the next 5 months from influenza. 27,000 is the amount that will die from prostate cancer. And as men, that's all we hear about. And 35,000 is the number that will die from breast cancer. And as women, that's all you hear about. Okay, now those are all important numbers. Breast cancer is a huge issue. Prostate cancer, we want to make sure it's gone. AIDS is something that is ravaging the world, and we have to get rid of it. Okay, and the war is something we have to stop. But I wanted you to see those numbers because none of those numbers are as big as the amount of people that are guaranteed to be dead in the next 5 months if we have a light flu epidemic this year. So when you see those numbers, you realize we're going to lose customers this year. Some of our customers will be dead before spring from colds and influenza. So it's a serious, serious disease epidemic that comes back and knocks on our door every year. Sometimes I mentioned it's a pandemic, and a pandemic is a scarier word in medicine. It means, oh, it's a really bad epidemic. And there have been pandemics in the past. The bubonic plague, sometimes called the Black Death, was a pandemic of the Middle Ages, and it killed people all over the world. Killed half the population of Europe. Wow, think of that. Half the population, 25 million people died in the 1300s of the Black Death or the bubonic plague. That's a pandemic. A huge pandemic was the Spanish flu or the Spanish influenza, and that hit right after World War I. And 100 million people died in the world over the next 2 years. That's twice as many people were killed by that flu than all of World War I. So we think of world wars and wars as being horrible things, but you can see that just little bacteria and virus are much more deadly than even the greatest forces of the planet with all their guns and bombs and missiles. A lot of people think, well, I'm kind of safe because I'm isolated, I don't live in LA, I live in a small town, or I live in Tahiti and I'm a fruitarian. But after the Spanish flu in 1918, they went to remote villages in Alaska where viruses are least likely to live because of the cold weather. And it's hard for them to breed. And they found entire villages dead on the ground in Alaska from a virus. So there's no real protection from a viral attack. It will go everywhere on this planet. No matter where you are, build a fallout shelter. It's going to get through even where the radiation doesn't penetrate. Also, pandemics, for some reason, and nobody knows why, hit people in the prime of their life. Normally, every year when we have a flu and influenza epidemic, the majority of people that die are little children, 0 to 5 years of age, because they don't have a mature immune system yet, and senior citizens in nursing homes or the hospitals. And certainly people of middle age get killed, and teenagers, but it's mostly the young and old with the more impaired immune systems that are more at risk. But when there's a pandemic, nobody knows why. The biggest age group is 20 to 40 that get killed, and nobody knows why, but that's the way it happens. And 50% of the deaths in a pandemic are in the prime age group. So if anybody says, well, I don't have to worry about it because I'm 30 years old and I'm in top shape, that's great if we have an epidemic. If this year's influenza turns into a pandemic and grows to those kind of proportions, the age group that'll get most deaths is that age group of 20 to 40. There was a little poem I read that was scary. Now, I'll backtrack for a second. I had a great uncle who fought with Teddy Roosevelt in Cuba, and then also fought in World War I. And when I was a little kid, I sat on his lap. And he told me, and I wrote this years ago in one of the newsletters, that World War I was hell. It was the trench wars through France. You're in trenches. They hit you with mustard gas. It's an herbal gas made from mustard that just burnt your flesh off. And machine guns were a new invention, and health wasn't an invention. The medics didn't know what to do. And it was just often, he said, that he would be fighting and using as a shield piles of rotten, dead bodies that were blown in half. I mean, it was probably one of the most horrific wars. If there's any good wars, this was not one. It was a horrific war. And he said nothing scared him as much as when he came home after World War I was over and he saw the bodies piled up in the streets from the Spanish flu. They were dying quicker than people could cart them away. In fact, in New York City, they used whole city buses and loaded them with bodies. Okay, this is a pretty scary talk, I know. But it's amazing because when I was a kid, there was a pandemic in 1957, and I was only about 5 years old, and that was the Asian flu pandemic. And that year, 70,000 Americans died, which is a lot more than 40,000, and our population was a lot less. 70,000 Americans died. 2 million people on the planet died from the Asian flu. And I remember being so sick that I was delirious. I was in a dream state with 106-degree fever. And I remember looking up and seeing really horrified, worried looks on my parents' faces because I was going to die. And that was the first episode I had that fever. And the drugs that I was giving scarred my heart. So that was one of the first reasons I not only was born with a genetically deformed heart, but then I got extra scarring from the Asian flu. And when I came out of it and I was better, there were holes in my neighborhood. There were people missing, people that died. And most of you aren't as old as me, so you weren't around then. But I have a memory of it. So it's not just the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. It's not just World War I, but this was the 1950s, almost 1960. And often pandemics reoccur every 40 or 50 years. And the reason I talk about this with the public and us is because everybody says we are overdue for our next pandemic. Is it going to be the bird flu? Who knows? The bird flu seems to have been up and down and up and down, but I'll let you know that the Asian flu that almost killed me, was a bird flu, was a type of bird flu. So this bird flu could come back one winter and do some butt kicking in this country and around the world. What do we know? There was an old poem I saw in a book about the Spanish flu. It said, I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. And a little kid had written that in the book. And what was frightening is just the amount of kids that died. I mean, you can go into certain towns in America and go to the graveyards, and you will find so many children deaths from that post-World War I influenza. So it's serious stuff. Now, I hope I'm not depressing anybody's immune system, but I just want you to know the serious nature of colds and flus, and I'll tell you some things that the Center for Disease Control is saying, and they try to downplay it because they don't want to panic anybody, but this is the importance of staying healthy, because what do we know? 40,000 Americans minimum are going to be dead in the next 5 months. I mean, that's a scary number. 200,000 will end up in the hospital, and 150 million cases of influenza will be in America, and 1 billion cases of colds and flus. So we want to be Dr. Schulze prepared.